Well, in a powerful statement to the international community, UNICEF released a statement on the Syrian civil war that was mostly blank. They said no words will do justice for all those killed in the conflict. Since Sunday, activists claim more than 380 people were killed by government airstrikes on the last rebel-held enclave of eastern Ghouta, which is on the outskirts of Damascus. But that number is just the tip of the iceberg in a war that has been going on for nearly 7 years. International relations expert Professor Robert Patman joins us to talk about the situation in Syria. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning, Hayley.
Well, this is a real tragedy, isn't it? Are we witnessing war crimes here?
Yes, the Geneva Convention does have rules about wars, and civilians have not been spared in this tragic conflict. More than 300,000 civilians have been killed in this 7-year-old civil war, and unfortunately the international community has largely looked on, apart from those interested participants who have supported either side. So it is a real tragedy, and we have to keep in mind it's just not the number of people killed, Hayley. 7 million people have been displaced from their homes in Syria, and more than 4 million have had to flee the country. So it's a catastrophic civil war.
As you said, it sort of looks like the international community are turning a blind eye. Meanwhile, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad seems he's like unmoved by any outside pressure or even reason. Meanwhile, the UN, all they can do is ask for a ceasefire. Why are they so impotent?
Well, there's a mismatch between this type of conflict and the international machinery available at the UN to deal with this type of war. The UN was set up in 1945. It remains largely unreformed in the UN Security Council, which is designed to deal with matters of peace and conflict. And unfortunately, when the UN was set up, it was largely designed to deal with wars between states, not within states. And what we have here, it's not that the international community or the UN Security Council has turned a blind eye. It's just that because of the veto mechanism, 5 countries in the UN, permanent members, they have the power to veto any resolution they don't like, which means 3 times between 2011 and 2012, the Obama administration, backed by more than 150 countries in the General Assembly, tried to pass a resolution which would have provided for President Assad to stand down to halt the civil war. But unfortunately, Russia vetoed it on each occasion. And then, what we've seen is the situation has just continued as before. Does
this veto mechanism need to go, do you think?
I think so. That's been the consistent position of New Zealand since 1945. But what it means is that the organisation internationally, which has responsibility for peace and order and preventing war, is completely impotent in one of the most, dangerous places in the world.
Speaking of impotent, there's been no aid or medical or any food supplies that have entered eastern Ghouta. Do you see any relief agencies gaining access to eastern Ghouta anytime soon?
It's possible. There's a resolution on the table in the UN Security Council. 2 sponsors, one is Sweden, the other one is Kuwait, which is calling for an immediate halt to all fighting for at least 30 days to allow emergency humanitarian supplies in. But personally, I'm not hopeful that resolution is going to be passed soon. The Russians have already called for discussions about the resolution, which to people promoting the resolution looks like a stalling tactic. The Russians, by the way, are deeply involved in this conflict. They're providing the airstrikes, which are happening virtually every minute. They've also got volunteers on the ground, so-called volunteers, otherwise mercenaries, and they are providing all-round military support, as is Iran, for the Assad dictatorship. The tragic thing about this conflict, Hayley, is that the Assad regime could not win this civil war without outside support, but it does seem to be prevailing through the most brutal means at the moment.
So this is just such a mess. And as we know, the best protection is prevention. How do we stop a situation like this happening in the future?
Well, I do think, going back to your original question about the UN Security Council, we need to reform the UN so that we have a means for authoritative resolutions from the world's leading international organisation can carry weight. But this is a ridiculous situation. It's not just Russia that vetoes things it doesn't like. The United States does the same with regard to the Palestinian occupation in the Middle East, because its ally Israel doesn't like that. So we have a situation where the leading powers, well, Russia, China and the United States, Britain and France hardly fall into that category, they can just veto anything they don't like, which means that in a world in which we've got 32 conflicts, 30 are civil wars, most of those conflicts cannot be effectively dealt with, unfortunately.
Right, very unfortunately. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Professor Robert Patman.
Thank you.
It's awful, isn't it? 6:45 on Breakfast. Still to come. We're going to cross live to Pyeongchang as New Zealand celebrates a double medal day at the Winter Olympics. And after the break, kids love their cartoons, but is it good for them to watch those fast edited shows?